Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be back with you. You can probably hear in my voice that I was a little bit sick last week and I'm just getting over it. So that's why we didn't have any programming last week, but we are starting the day off with, or the week off with, a great show, and we will have at least one more before the week is out. So good to be back with you. It was good to see some folks this weekend in Philly. Saw Dr. Jared Ball, saw M2 Gant, saw some other folks at a film screening that M2 held at Making Worlds. So that was really fun to connect with folks, and shout out to all those people. And today we're going to be talking about the lost and early writings of James Connolly, which is something I'm really excited to discuss. This is a really cool book. I definitely recommend that people, one, people always remind people, I should always remind people, is that you can get free PDFs of all the books that Iskra Books puts out. So you can just download it and check it out for yourself. But I definitely recommend that people do purchase the books because Iskra, does all of this work. Um, I think all of them do it for free basically, and just, do the work to publish these important works, which are usually, works that are not translated into English, or ones like this where there's a great deal of, history that has kind of been lost or hidden or not properly attended to. And so it's really a great service to all of us, on the left, that they're doing this publishing work. So I definitely encourage people to buy those books and support their ability to continue to do that. Plus, it's a really beautiful looking book. I haven't received my copy yet, but I did order one and it is coming. And the cover is really beautiful. There's always really good artwork that they do. So anyway, just shout out to Iskra Books. Make sure you head over to their website and check it out. And at the very least, download yourself a copy of the book. Um, our guest today is Conor McCabe. I had this, but let me pull back up his bio. So Dr. Conor McCabe is a research fellow with Queen's Business School, Queen's University Belfast. He is the author of numerous policy and research reports, including Smoke and Mirrors, the facts about retail workers' incomes in Ireland, towards an anti-poverty strategy for Clare, and Hungry Bellies Are Not Equal to Full Bellies, exploring inequality and deprivation in Ireland. He's also the author of two Irish political economy books, Sins of the Father and Money. He works mainly with grassroots political, trade union, artist, and community groups, exploring the dynamics of theory and action for societal change. So great work that he's doing, and really interesting research too on Irish political economy. I had checked out a few of his talks online that were really good. So anyways, without further ado, I'm going to bring Connor to the stage so we can start talking about this book and talk about the works of James Connolly here. So Connor, it's good to be with you today.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Thank you, first of all, for doing this book, and and then joining us to discuss it.
No, I'm happy to. It's great.
Yeah, so I know, it's not kind of the point of this book, obviously, is to collect all of these works. There's really not and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there's really not a proper collected works of James Connolly, which is one of the things that you note in the introduction. But before we start talking about a little bit more about what this book is and what's in it, why don't we just say a few things about James Connolly's life and kind of politics that make him really worth studying as a revolutionary, as an anti-imperialist, and as a socialist. Obviously, you're writing this or compiling this from the Irish context where he's very important, but just more broadly, maybe a few things about his life specific to also the time period that we're talking about and some of the pieces that we're reading in this book.
Sure. I mean, he was born in Edinburgh, in Scotland, in 1868, of kind of Irish parents, and the part of Edinburgh he was born in is called like Cowgate, and it was very much the kind of Irish part of like Edinburgh at that time. His father and mother both came from Ireland. His mother's side, we believe, were from Monaghan. His father's side, we can't really be sure. It seems to be kind of Monaghan, Armagh, what's now the kind of border kind of area in like on the island. His father worked for the on contract for kind of Edinburgh Council as a street cleaner, and like as a carter, and this is a job that both James and his older brother John both held in later years. We have kind of documents. We know that he was in kind of Edinburgh until at least 1881. That was the census. So he's a baker's kind of apprentice in Edinburgh in that year, and then he drops off. We don't know kind of where he went. There are certain rumors, but we have no kind of firm evidence. And he next shows up in around 1888, 1889. He's in Dundee. That's also in Scotland, and he's writing to his future wife. So from then onwards, we have a fairly coherent and fairly kind of comprehensive kind of view of his kind of activism. When he shows up in like 1889, 1890, and by that I mean he shows up in the archives. He's already a firm kind of socialist, and he's heavily involved in the socialist movement in kind of Edinburgh, along with his brother John. And his brother John is an interesting character who has been kind of written out of kind of history as well. He was about kind of 6 years older than him, and for the next kind of 4 or 5 years, they are thick as thieves in Edinburgh. Whatever kind of socialist or kind of Marxist group is being formed, they're in there, and they're formulating ideas and policy and kind of education as well. They were both kind of street kind of agitators. And that's where kind of Connolly kind of learns his craft. It's obvious from his letters, though, that he was always quite bookish. Even in his early letters, he's quoting quite liberally from Shakespeare, from the Bible, from Walt Whitman, from the poets of the time. And what I like about the quotes is that he sometimes gets a word wrong or kind of one or two wrong, and that for me is really kind of positive, because it shows that it's from memory. It's not a kind of a affectation. He's not sitting there with a library of books trying to show up how clever he is. He just loves kind of writing, and he loves kind of kind of these words. So he's extremely well read. He's quite articulate, and he's quite good as a street kind of agitator. So he becomes fairly kind of prominent fairly quickly, not only in the socialist movement in Scotland, but in England as well. And that's mainly through the Independent kind of Labour Party that's been kind of set up by kind of Keir Hardie. By around 1894, 1895, we can see some kind of development in his ideas. More and more Ireland and the Irish question enters into it, but he brings a Marxist framework to that, and for me that was his big kind of innovation, and not just in terms of Ireland, but in terms of like Marxism itself. For me, he was a pioneer. He's not the inventor of it. No one is an inventor of an idea. He was a very smart guy, as others after him, and applied his Marxist kind of training or kind of reading to the Irish kind of situation, and saw what we would see now as a colonial kind of setup. And it's interesting even reading Marx and Engels, kind of during these times, because Connolly's writing about 10 years after Marx has died, but the last 10, 15 years of kind of Marxist life, he also went on that journey, which is also quite interesting. From seeing Ireland as just a farmyard for Britain into a colonial space, and so Connolly also kind of sees this, and that's what he brings to his writing. So by 1896, he's quite involved in the British kind of Labour Party movement. Although James Connolly is more kind of infamous now being a kind of trade unionist. It's not really until about 1907, when he's living in the States, that he starts working for the trade union. He's a political activist and he's a street agitator. And 1896, he moves, it seems, back to Dublin. He marries. His wife is from Wicklow, and they move back with their 3 kids to Dublin, where he forms the Irish Socialist Republican Party, which is the first socialist Republican party in Irish history. He more or less invents that entire kind of tradition, and he throws himself into the politics of the city, a city that we know that from his other writings he loved. He writes in his letters about just this love he had for Dublin, and it really kind of comes through, in his own kind of writings. So that's pretty much where we kind of pick up on him, is that he's involved in the socialist movement in Edinburgh, and then he's involved in the socialist movement in Dublin, and trying to bring a very particular kind of Marxist, kind of colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial Marxism to the Irish situation. Will I go on to his death, or will we?
Yeah, you can't. I mean, I know that's not really the
Yeah.
period you're looking at in the book, but maybe just say a little bit about. I mean, I think obviously it's important how he dies and what what's going on. So yeah,
very much so. So from 1896 until 1903, he's involved in the ISRP, which is Socialist Republican Party, and he's trying to be a full-time kind of agitator. So he's getting money from street talks, from a bit of work for party work. He sets up his own newspaper, the Workers' Common Republic, in 1898. And that's why this is a trend for James Connolly, but he doesn't have an output, he makes one. he just creates an entire newspaper, and he does this again in the States. He moves to the States in 1903, but he moves because he's kicked out of his own party by the right wing in the party in 1903. It is a split in the party. It's built today as being, it's seen as a kind of personality clash. These things are rarely purely kind of personality clashes. There's also ideology there as well. And one of the people who who he was fighting with is a man called E.W. Stewart, who becomes quite kind of prominent in the right wing of the trade union movement in the 1910s and the 1920s. Well, 1910s anyway. So he had toured the estates in 1902 at the kind of request of the American Labour Party, of the Socialist Labour Party. And that went quite well. He starts off in New York. He ends up in San Francisco. He goes as far as north as kind of Canada as well. So it's a fairly kind of comprehensive 3-month kind of speaking tour. When he comes back, some of the funds he had been raised had been kind of misspent. He forces a vote on his role in the party. He loses that, so he leaves. He leaves for New York in 1903. In 1904, his family follow him over. His eldest daughter dies at this time as well, in quite kind of tragic kind of accident. And he lived first in New York City, and then to Troy, kind of Buffalo, and then he moved to Newark in New Jersey. This is probably the period of his time. He's in the States from 1903 until 1910. It's the first time he has a living wage. He's actually working at this stage. He's working for a while for Singer, who made the sewing kind of machines. He blagged his way into that. As a manager, there's a large kind of Singer kind of sewing factory in Scotland, and he just said, "Oh, I worked there. I was a manager there," and he kind of fell his way into this kind of managerial kind of spot. But he's heavily involved as he always was in the socialist kind of movement, he learns kind of Italian to work in terms of kind of reaching out like to the Italian kind of migrants in like New York. He writes about 3 or 4 articles in kind of Italian as well. He was quite proud of his kind of fluency. It seems that he could at least read French. I don't know whether he spoke it that well. Maybe some German as well. He claims to have spoken Irish, but I can't find any evidence like of that. But that gives you a character of the man himself. Like he learns kind of Italian as part of his activism. But he's always trying to get back to Ireland. He sees Ireland as his life's work and as his main thing. He says in like one letter in like 1908, he says, "For me, the cause is like everything, and if I'm not doing it, then I don't really want to do really kind of anything else in this life. The cause in 21st century Ireland has a different meaning to the cause in kind of 1908. He meant kind of socialism and building a kind of socialist Ireland. So he's able to move back. He sets up a new kind of newspaper in like 1908 called the Harp, and he sees it actually does quite well. He's able to become a full-time writer based on kind of subscriptions to it. His plan then was to move the paper back to Dublin and then just send it via subscription. So that's his plan, to move back down to Dublin. He moves back in kind of 1910. That kind of falls through the Harp. So he ends up working for a new industrial unionism, a trade union called the Irish Transport Workers Union. That had been set up a few years kind of previously by a man called Jim Larkin, who's a prominent figure in like US kind of labor history as much as kind of Irish one as well. So he becomes a full-time trade union kind of agitator, but never stops being a kind of political agitator as well. He moves to Belfast in 1911. He publishes his most famous work, Labour in Irish History, that year. And then he gets involved in the 1913 kind of lockout, which was a class war that became kind of world news in kind of 1913 from August 1913 to around January 1914. At the outbreak of the war, he sees this now as time for Ireland to have its own kind of rebellion, and his reason for that was mainly down to the threat of conscription. He would see this as being like the end of any hope for an anti-imperialist kind of like anti-colonial kind of uprising. Connolly was always a kind of revolutionary. That was always his way of thinking, and very few of us are. So it's hard for us to really kind of get our heads around that was what he was aiming for his entire life. He formed while the lockout was on. He was involved in setting up a workers' kind of militia called the Irish kind of Citizen Army, and by 1916, in late 1915, early 1916, he's making plans quite publicly. he's writing about it like in his newspaper that now's the time for some kind of violent resistance to it. Even though conscription had been brought in for the Great War in Britain, it hadn't been brought in Ireland, even though Ireland was part of the UK then, for fear of the very thing that Connolly was planning. But the war was going so badly that they could see that this was just a matter of time. So at the same time, there's a parallel, a revolutionary a tradition in Ireland that would be the IRB and the Fenians, and the two groups kind of they meet up and they decide to plan an uprising together for April or Easter 1916. So Connolly, some of the plans kind of fall through at the last minute. There was some arms that were due from Germany. They're seized before they can land. the rebellion is called off at the last minute, but a small group around James Connolly and the IRB, they decide it's going to go ahead, and they take over parts of Dublin on the 24th of April 1916. They hold parts of the city for about 6 days. Eventually, they all kind of surrender. Connolly is wounded during the fighting, and the British state starts to execute um, uh, like the leaders of it. And Connolly, he's the last to be executed on the 12th of May, mainly because of his injuries. He was wounded in the leg. He like couldn't stand, and he was finally executed on the morning of the 12th of May, like 1916, and he was shot like in a chair because he couldn't stand. That is that's as condensed as can make his
No,
entire
that's great.
life at
Yeah.
the moment. But like what you get in Ireland, and why I think what kind of drove me to write kind of this book, or to start kind of editing his entire works, is that is those parallel kind of traditions in terms of kind of rebellion in Ireland. There's a purely kind of nationalist one, and that we would call republicanism. It's different to the US kind of meaning of that word. But you get kind of Connolly is dealing with something different. His is very much an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial Marxism, which puts him out of kilter with most of the mainstream kind of Marxist thinking in Britain at that time, and also kind of puts him out of kilter with the more conservative nationalists, what I would call this kind of middleman comprador kind of class. That's part of any kind of colonial kind of setup. And Connolly, he kind of theorizes this class, you know, at the time as well. And that for me is one of his great kind of innovations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I know we'll touch on that a little bit more. So let's talk about what this book actually is, what it composes. There are, as you note in the introduction, a couple other Connolly readers that are out there. There's, a couple of his more prominently known books, Labor and Irish History, The Reconquest of Ireland. And it had never really dawned on me personally that there would be so much of his work that was kind of out there and had not been kind of compiled
Mm.
into something more like what you're doing. Um, and so you lay out in the book's introduction some of the process of, compiling the book and the gaps that you found were missing in what was published of his work. So just start a little bit by, laying out, you know, kind of what the new pieces of this book are, and what there's also stuff that you've republished that uh so there's stuff that was never published, and there's stuff that was published initially, like maybe in magazine or newspaper article kind of form, that was never put into a kind of collected works. But yeah, say a little bit about those gaps that you fill in with this book, and what this book is.
Sure. Like to make sense of it, like I did have to go into the publishing history of like James Connolly, because there are gaps in his writings that have been kind of published, and that's not by mistake. That's on purpose. In the independent state that set up on the island in like 1922, it's known as the Irish kind of Free State. Ireland is like partitioned. There's kind of Northern Ireland, and then there's the Free State kind of down south. And in the Free State, it's a quite conservative state that is being kind of formed. There's still kind of radical spaces in it, but by kind of mid 1930s, that's all kind of that's all been kind of dampened down. But what you get is something that is quite common in other kind of colonial kind of setups, where that kind of um, nationalist but pro-imperialist class who want to keep all the links with the empire, they're the ones who more or less set the terms of the Free State. And there's a kind of a corporatist trade union kind of movement then that is kind of formulated. The right wing of the trade union movement. Um, it's its relationship to this kind of state is very much on a kind of what we would see as kind of it's a quasi kind of fascist kind of trade unions where you have um, kind of Catholic social teaching is the main kind of framework for kind of trade unionism in Ireland. It's not socialism, and it's certainly not kind of James Connolly. So they have this problem in that they have kind of James Connolly. They have an out and out anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, Marxist Republican, but he's also a martyr. So what do you do? So well, what you do is that with any kind of martyr, as with kind of Joan of Arc, you start kind of cutting away those pieces which you don't like, and you get this hybrid kind of Connolly that is kind of put forward, where he's turned into a Christian socialist, because that suits, and a trade unionist as well, because that suits the ideology of the Free State, itself. But you still have a small but quite vibrant kind of communist kind of movement in Ireland. So they're able to keep on producing his books and his pamphlets, but his letters and his articles, they're under kind of lock and key, and they're kind of dribbled out. So that's where I've been kind of focusing in on, is those kind of writings. And what you start to see is the Marxism had been taken out as much as they could get away with, and the anti-colonialism had been kind of taken out, and his identification of that intermediary comprador kind of class had been more or less kind of taken out, kind of there as well. So, like, I was not expecting to find so much that was new. I remember the first time I found a new bit of writing, just my research. I went, oh my God, I have one piece. This is great. I mean, this will be good for the book. I have one new piece of writing. And then I found 18. And I went from being happy to being extremely kind of pissed off, because he's been dead for 110 years. I should not be finding anything that's new for someone who is kind of so lauded and so talked about and so referenced. Connolly has to be one of the most quoted and least read figures in like Irish history. He's the most quoted and the least read. And so my job or my task is to try and kind of put that kind of back out there. So what I found was that I found 18 completely lost pieces of work, 11 articles, 3 lost letters, and 4 pieces of fiction of like short stories. And then I found the 17 pieces that had been kind of edited by the right wing in the trade union movement, mainly in 1948. And unfortunately, those versions have been reproduced online. Many, not all, but many of the versions of Connolly's articles on Marxist.org are unfortunately versions that are the truncated, like edited kind of versions of the right wing in the labor movement. So it's unfortunate that they were, in the time of the internet in the early 2000s, they were reproduced and given a whole new lease of life, which is unfortunate that people didn't go back to the originals then. So that was the main thing, is to try and like start at the, I suppose it was being kind of a bit more forceful, I'd say, amateur hour is over, that like this is now kind of Connolly studies. So we start with the actual kind of texts, and then you work your way up then, kind of from that. So that's the main kind of gist of it. So I have transcribed all of his known works. It's about 800,000 words, because I wanted to make sure that I had the end of this piece. I wanted to make sure that this project was finished before I started with the first book. So from now on, it's just a case of tidying them up, footnoting them. But it's there. It's on my hard drive. It's 800,000 words of kind of James Connolly. Of about 250,000 have been published so far.
That's great. So do you plan to do multiple editions of this then and put out like different periodizations? Because I know this one's 1889 to 1898.
Yeah. So, but that's the plan. I mean, like I'll see what the reaction is, but to this one. But like, I would be thinking of like, I said to myself, I'd give myself a break, and sure I can't. So I'm back into it. So I'm back into 1898 to 1903, and that's a different beast. Like that's around even before I started looking for lost writings. That's around 250,000 words. So even for that, 1898 to 1903, that's a monster. Then we get into the States from 1903 to 1910, and I know like there's a real gap in his writings during this period, and I know this. I know enough of this man now to know that he's not going to keep quiet. It's not in him. He does
Yeah.
not shut up. So there has to be stuff in US kind of journals which I haven't kind of found from 1903 on until 1910. There's been great work been done by is a revolutionary bandstand, I think their name is. It's online, but it's a small kind of website that's been reproducing kind of articles from the people from social kind of labor parties kind of kind of newspaper, including Lost Connolly. So it's great that they actually published some of the Italian articles there recently. So I mean, so some of the stuff is kind of coming out, but it needs kind of more work. And then from 1910 until 1916, half of his writings is during that period. It's about 400,000 words. It's absolutely massive. So there's a lot of work in them, but at least I know that the job, like I did a first draft of all of it. So it is just about kind of getting time and actually kind of putting them out there. But it's not just about like one. He deserves it. He deserves to be treated seriously, and his writings do. So, like that in itself would kind of like would kind of justify reproducing his entire kind of works as they were written. But my interest in him is that is as a Marxist in the 21st century. What I'm interested in is the tradition that Connolly came from, which is not just the Republican one, which is where he's also kind of put into. There's a whole hidden radical history in Irish kind of history that's been written out going back to the 1820s, and Connolly writes about these people and these kind of groups, and he saw himself as part of that. Where you have in the independence kind of movement, there's the conservative. All we need is our parliament back, and then we're grand. And then it's the more kind of radical ones who says, no, we need to deal with, in their words, the social question. And the social question was workers' rights, housing, all of these kind of other things, which the conservatives didn't want to deal with because they wanted to keep all the inequalities kind of there. So Connolly spoke to that. So for me, I mean, I can like going back, elective articles in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, that Connolly saw himself as part of that kind of tradition. So for me, it's more than just the worst thing ever would be to treat Connolly as kind of unique, as a flash in the pan. That there was no Marxism and there was no kind of radicalism from a social, from a social kind of point of view. Connolly shows up and then he's gone, and then it's back to the priests again, which is kind of how Irish history is kind of written. So I want to rediscover that entire thing for my own selfish kind of Marxist reasons. Because have I been talking too much?
No, 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 no.
This is
No.
okay. I
Yeah.
like I feel like I'm just talking, just like ranting on. Like when you work so long on like James Connolly, you do turn into that guy who shows up in the library just with plastic bags of papers, just ranting at people. So I do feel that as well. So can it bear
Well,
with me?
I'll just say that this is the podcast for the person with the bags of papers who
I
wants
am
to
I
go
am
on
I
a
am
rant. So you're welcome.
I
Like,
am home.
feel free. Yeah.
I am home then. So so like like we can use history and we can use kind of Connolly's writings in many ways. The main way his writings have been used is as scripture. So you get this with Lenin and you get this with Marx as well, where people treat it the same way as kind of as the Bible. They look for quotes to then throw at each other to prove to further on kind of stand. And I think that I know that this is going to happen even with what kind of I've done here. But what I'm interested in is, if, going back to how kind of Marxists should use history or kind of see history. History For Marxists, I believe anyway, it's a canvas that allows us to observe deep social and economic forces in motion. There's very, very few other kind of disciplines that give us that view of how the actually existing mode of production and exchange, how it operates, and then what are the class relations that emerge out of that very particular mode of production and exchange. And you need that canvas to observe it. Same as with climate change. You can't observe changes in the climate by looking at the weather each day. You need that 30, 50, 100-year kind of viewpoint. And that's the same for these kind of class relations. So for me, Connolly, he's our man in the 1900s, phoning it in. He's sticking his head out the window. He's looking around. He's telling us how actually existing Irish kind of capitalism is working. It's a one-way kind of conversation, but he's phoning it in. He's telling us kind of what's going on. A bit like Bruce Willis in like 12 Monkeys. He's picking up that phone and he's telling them, this is what I'm seeing here. But then as Marxists, we can take that from what he's seeing in how it's working in 1900. I can then look at very interesting kind of Irish Marxists in the 1930s, like Pater O'Donnell and Brian O'Neill, and then look at what I can write about and kind of what I can observe, and that helps me see this kind of intermediary comprador kind of class, how they operate, and how they function, and also the very particular colonial capitalist mode of production and exchange as it formulated in Ireland, and one that in the last kind of 10, 15 years of their lives fascinated both Marx and like Engels, who saw it and actually like write about how Britain is engaged in like making mini Irelands all across the world. This is its template now. So for me, like this is also about seeing how capitalism works in the core. Ireland has that kind of weird kind of history in that like it has a somewhat, and I hate the phrase, but I'm kind of stuck for it. Like you have this kind of global south history, but in a global north location. So it's a weird kind of mix. But that gives us insight into how kind of capitalism works. That even if in the core something like Ireland not only exists, but it's absolutely fundamental to the operation of British kind of capitalism, then that tells us something about how kind of capitalism works in the core itself. And that's really is my kind of life's work. It is kind of teasing that out. And for me, kind of Connolly, I'm just being selfish. He's a Marxist. I have 20 years, 30 years of writings from an Irish Marxist at the turn of the 20th century, telling us about class, culture, how these things kind of operate, how they kind of work wherever. And I just want to delve into that because then that helps me see that wider kind of canvas in how kind of Ireland. So for me, Connolly and what he's telling us about actually existing colonial kind of capitalism in Ireland helps me explain the Apple tax case, helps me explain why Ireland is a tax haven today. I can see it. I can see precisely that class in the 1900s. That helps me view that today. So for me, like that's why I'm doing this. And the byproduct is that it's just that one of the things where you kind of go, well, if no one else is going to do it, then fuck it, I'll do it. So that's all the works now here as well. But it really is just me just making sure that it's absolutely brilliant what he's writing about. And he is a pioneer of that kind of anti-imperialist, anti-colonial Marxism that comes to the fore in the wake of the First World War and most certainly after the Second World War globally. Connolly's there doing these things in the 1900s.
Yeah. No, thank you for doing it, and yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. Um, so we'll get into more of the specifics here in a minute, but what are some of the things you found? I mean, there's a lot, there's a lot of different types of writing that are collected here, and
Mm.
I found that really interesting. And they're different types, but with the exception of, I mean, really all of them, even the letters, but you see the socialist kind of viewpoint through all of it, right? So there's fiction, there's letters from, personal correspondence. There's obviously, articles, right, that could be in, whether it's kind of a journal or a magazine, or like more like a newspaper, but kind of an agitational, or pamphlets, things like this. Um, and so say a little bit more about what bringing these things together for you and looking at this period, um, kind of showed you about him as an agitator, and also as kind of an artist, as well as being he's a political analyst as well. So there's all of these kind of components of it. So yeah, say a little bit about that.
Anytime he was asked what his job was, he would normally say journalist or like writer, and that's what I see him as now. Again, like Marx, he's a writer. He's an agitator as well, but I find him to be quite funny, and I hope others going to see that as well. He's like Marx as well. He can be quite sharp, and he's quite witty, and he's quite biting. Um, so for me, what I find kind of interesting is the fact that he is first and foremost he's a writer, and he's quite brilliant at it. The reason for bringing all these things together was that, like in the other volumes, I'd probably have too much in the actual writings themselves that I probably couldn't get into those kind of snippets or into the other parts. But I just explained that to people that like in the book, there's the writings, there's letters, there's secondary kind of reports of speeches, and then there's newspaper kind of snippets, there as well. For me, all of putting them all together into one book was very important, because one of the arguments that you see in terms of kind of James Connolly kind of studies, if I want a better phrase, is that he went on this journey from socialist to a nationalist, and he lost his way in like 1915 and 1916, and fell in with a bad crowd, and fell in with these kind of nationalists, and then walked into the GPO, which as a socialist he should never have done. Just regardless of those arguments, or the kind of merit of them, it's a very strong element in terms of kind of how kind of James Connolly is seen. What you see from his writings here is that it's there from the get go. Like he emerges well. I say from the get go. Certainly from around 1895 onwards, you can see that he has come to the conclusion. He's at that stage. He's well versed in kind of Marxism. He spent 5, 6 years constantly kind of engaged in this kind of debates, and he brought that scientific kind of element to the Irish kind of situation, and came to an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist kind of conclusion, and stuck with it then for the next kind of 20 years, um, which is not the argument that you get in the majority of like Connolly studies, where you do get this kind of view that he was wrong to go in with the nationalists, and you're there going, you're missing the point. This is a colonial kind of situation. You don't have that choice. Like that's it, like nationalism or an independence kind of movement is part and parcel of your anti-colonial kind of a struggle. That is like that's the way that imperialism has kind of set up this game. Um, Connolly gets that, and also knows that if you don't get rid of the economic um, imperial strands, then it'll make no difference. So you can't just have kind of political um, delegate independence. So when Connolly talks about how you can't trust the middle classes, even though that would be kind of part of the course in kind of Marxist kind of studies, it takes on a different view in Ireland, because he's also talking about the anti-British nationalists in middle classes, who will say all the right things around how we need kind of our own kind of parliament. And he says, no, they want to keep all the economic kind of strings, the 8,000 economic strings that are tied back to the empire. And that's what they do. In 1922, Ireland stays part of the Sterling area. So with um, and its main exports are people and cattle. These are the two things that are being kind of exported kind of over. So he called it quite well, thinking of all these things. But you see from his writings that it's more or less there from at least 1895 onwards. And even in terms of the British kind of Labour Party, he's coming over to Dublin to set up, it seems, a branch of the British Independent Labour Party. But in the few letters that have survived of him talking to, or like writing to kind of Keir Hardy, who's leader of the party, he has convinced Hardy that you can't do that in Ireland. It has to be an independent Irish socialist kind of party, and that's what Higgins sets up. So from then onwards, he has come to the conclusion that, like Krabal and other anti-imperialist kind of writers came to in the 30s, 40s, and like 50s. Connolly, it's not that he's first; it's just that because isn't any first, he just did what they do kind of later on. He applies his kind of Marxist kind of his Marxist kind of methodologies to the actually existing colonial capitalist mode of production and exchange, and the very particular colonial class relations that are there as well, which are different to the class relations in the core. So he went on that journey himself. Him, I think his brother as well, and that group that he was part of. So for me, that's what I find kind of fascinating. That it just blows out of the water this idea that he lost his kind of socialism, the arrogance that comes from kind of British Marxism, which as we all know is the worst form of Marxism possible. It's shit. It's absolutely shit. And we all know this. Is that how do we tell them? I don't know. Do we tell them? I don't know. Maybe they'll find out. They look for themselves, and of course they won't. They'll never find out. But it's absolutely horseshit. So you have kind of Connolly battling with that in the 1910s, and because you have pretty much, if not a pro kind of imperialist, it's certainly imperialist kind of friendly kind of Marxism that is just running through kind of British kind of Marxism, and still does, as we see with with kind of Palestine. But so that's what I've kind of fascinating. That's my long answer for saying that that's what I think is interesting. He saw not only class struggle, but the anti-imperialist liberation kind of struggle as a scientific necessity in order to achieve kind of socialism in Ireland.
100%. And that was one of the things that really stood out to me reading it, and I kind of had a question that I developed sort of related to this, that you talked about, you mentioned Cabral. But yeah, I mean, you see, I see reading it, wow, like there's some of the conclusions that Fanon comes to, there's some that
Yeah,
Cabral comes to, that Nkrumah comes to. Really, you think of this term, neocolonialism, right? Or this fear of that, once you get flag of independence, that then you're going to still be basically politically and economically subverted to the imperial core through this kind of colonial bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie,
yeah,
um, and he doesn't of course use the term neocolonialism, that hadn't
no,
been coined yet, but he sees those same concerns, and to be able to see them too ahead of independence, right? Because they hadn't achieved any kind of independence
no,
yet,
no,
but yet he's afraid of, or not afraid of, but he's constantly concerned and very critical, like super critical of, what he calls kind of the home rule politicians, and yeah, some of the kind of the landlord classes, the people within Ireland that he knows will continue to be economically linked up with Britain,
mm,
with England, and that basically he's able to foresee that flag independence is is obviously they need independence, and he doesn't he has that nationalist Republican side to him. He
Mm.
understands the necessity of that, but he also understands and is very clear in articulating like this will still be a big problem if we don't, you know, deal with the social and economic issues that have the masses of kind of laboring and poor Irish people, you know, subjugated. And so yeah, I don't know if there's other things that you wanted to say on that point, but I just found that really, as you said, kind of fascinating the way that, like you said, they're all coming to that conclusion because they're analyzing their own situations through a kind of Marxist
Yeah,
framework.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like what kind of like what kind of Connolly kind of argues, and again, this is somewhat using our language kind of today. He does use kind of imperialism and the empire very much so. But like what he's more or less kind of saying in the 1890s, this is like 20 years, 20, 30 years before kind of partial kind of independence. And he's more or less saying that capitalism is not just an economic system, it's an imperialist system. And if you don't get that, then you don't get why we need to break with capitalism to be kind of independent. Then you don't get it because we're not set up like it's something that is sometimes kind of thrown at kind of James Connolly that he wanted to get Ireland to return to a form of pre-industrial Celtic kind of communism, and this is used a lot there against him. What he argued is that no, like he says on page 3 of it shows again, just going back to how kind of James Connolly is quoted but not read. Says me going to quote him now, but he says that 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 the vast mass of the Irish people, many of whom still mix with their dreams of liberty, longings for a return to the ancient system of land tenure, now organically impossible. So, despite the fact that he says that on page 3 of Labour in like Irish history, his most famous work, it's still going to thrown at him because what he's saying is that he says in that in Labour in Irish history as well, Ireland would have turned capitalist anyway, but its its road to that was interrupted by imperialism, by colonialism, and this is an argument that that the Lebanese Marxist Amel makes as well. A book on like a book on like a book on Lebanon. That Lebanon also would have ended up kind of capitalist, but it had its route to that changed by kind of colonialism. So what emerged was colonial capitalism, and that's a different beast to your corporate capitalism, very much so. And Connolly has that kind of realization, back in April 1898, because one of the interesting things about this book was that was able through kind of Iskra to get a Polish article he had written um, for a Polish magazine that was published in Polish in April 1898. And when we got it translated, I just realized that this is actually a first draft of the first chapter of Labour in the Irish history. I was astounded that the first chapter of the Gobby's first draft of it ends up, it's been published in Polish. It's the very first time. But in that, as early as 1898, he's able to say is that capitalism arrives in Ireland through a different road than it does in France or in Belgium or in the Netherlands or in Germany. It's a colonial road, and that breeds different class relations, and it breeds different institutional supports for those kind of class relations, and it brings in different coercive measures to enable those different kind of class relations to reproduce themselves in the face of overwhelming hostility. So you have all these things that are going on, and Connolly came to these conclusions. I wouldn't say by himself. Again, going back to finding some of his brother's kind of writings, which are also very sharp and quite Marxist. So wherever group he was part of, in Edinburgh. They're having these kind of debates in their group, and then Connolly's writing about it then kind of afterwards. But that's what I find it fascinating, is that it's there. It shows again just the robustness of like Marxism, that independent of kind of each other, these other kind of great writers came to the same kind of conclusion.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. So I want to talk about one of the pieces a little bit. So there's one piece in it that's called "What Might Happen," and this
Yeah,
is a fictional piece.
yeah.
And I mean, all of his fiction is very good, you know. I mean, and I think that I'm always impressed by people who can move between uh you know, writing essays and as you say, he does a lot of journalism, so a lot of journalistic kind of articles. You know, he deals with local elections and, you know, all kinds of stuff. But then to be able to write fiction and to do it, you know, as a kind of really as an agitator, right? To think about,
Hmm.
okay, I'm gonna get a message across in this, but I'm gonna tell a story. And so maybe talk a little bit about this piece, or other things that, you know, kind of generally impressed you about his fictional work.
Yeah, I mean, there were four stories that 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 were written by that Connolly wrote under the pseudonym of Brehon, and I was able to identify Connolly as the writer through key phrases which are kind of unique to him. And one of these pieces, it's a fictional piece about it's a private in the army in Britain, in a town in like England, and they're called upon to kind of shut down a strike or a protest, like outside a factory, and and the and the protagonist gains his own kind of class kind of consciousness through a very kind of sentimental route, but does, and and rejects that kind of move. Um, what I find interesting in like all his writings is that no matter what he wrote, and I've yet to find something outside of his personal letters to his wife where he's not trying to raise class consciousness. Everything he wrote, the short stories, the poems, the songs, he's trying to raise class consciousness constantly, and that is one of the pieces. I I liked it. I'm more of a fan of of the other pieces. The transfusion of blood I thought was quite funny, and it has like, I don't know whether you've ever come across the Irish writer Flann O'Brien by any chance. Oh, you've got it. Oh, he's one of our best kept kind of secrets. Um, but very surreal writer, and transfusion of blood has a kind of quasi Flann O'Brien feel to it. There's another one called A Free Kind of Breakfast Table that has an almost kind of Joycean stroll through kind of Dublin
Hmm.
City, and that was written or published in 1895. And just the level of detail of the city of Dublin shows that he was in Dublin during that period. And it's a homeless guy who walks from Drumcondra Bridge on the north side of the city over to Thomas Street on the south side in the Liberties. It's about an hour and 10-minute walk. And he gives this wonderful kind of a description of the city as he walked through. And he may have, himself and James Joyce may have kind of met each other, because Stanislas Joyce, who's James Joyce's brother, says that James Joyce, he used to go to meetings of the socialists in Dublin. And if he's gone to kind of socialist meetings in 1901, 1902, 1903, the chances are it's James Connolly who's speaking. Anyway, that's just kind of by the by. That's more of a Dublin thing, just Dublin being so small. But like in all these stories, it's all about raising class consciousness, be it in terms of privates in the army who are compelled to, who have been told to act against, to actually kind of fire on their own class, to uh, to homeless guys in Dublin City who have to put up with the hypocrisy of that comprador class, who talk about how kind of independence will like solve everything, but there's homeless on the streets, you know. And that's what I find, you know, and like it really is kind of you know, a joy. And then there's the agitator's wife, which has wonderful um kind of gender politics in it, where he highlights, he's making fun of himself for going out on the street and talking about, you know, like women's rights, and then like coming home and expecting for his dinner to be cooked and everything made then for him, you know. And it's very interesting, you know, even then, because I mean that's something that just kind of, you know, that runs through kind of, I don't know about in the US, but like in Ireland, socialist kind of circles can be extremely misogynist. It's very much a macho kind of thing, whatever, and it won't face up to it. It just won't deal with it. You know, it'll give all the kind of gender kind of lines, but it's actually it's deeply kind of misogynist. So it's interesting for me seeing kind of Connolly highlight that even as early as kind of 1895.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that that's, you know, I can't speak for everybody, but yeah, I mean, that's is certainly is very often where the rhetoric and the analysis around patriarchy and misogyny and sexism, et cetera, is usually further along than the practice for sure. You know,
uh,
to put it
and that's being and
very
that's being
generously, right?
generous. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
been very
Yeah.
generous.
Um, so so let's talk a little bit more about this Christian socialist thing, which you talked about, you know, because this is, as you mentioned, this is kind of one of the ways that within the political reality and who the dominant kind of forces become within Ireland, that they can kind of can kind of pull some Connolly along, you know, you continue to use some of his work, but kind of fit him into this Christian socialist tradition, which is its own tradition, you know.
Mm,
And one of the things that's interesting with this is that I should say too is that on the one hand, I mean, this is kind of a two-part question, because on the one hand, you know, several of the pieces that you include, I think, make it quite clear that he is not approaching Christianity or not approaching socialism from a kind of moralistic or
yeah.
this is the kind of you know, utopian Christian sort of society that we need to build, or this is we need to take care of the poor kind of, you know, thing that you can have
Mm,
within a Christian socialism. But he does he also recognizes that he's dealing with and he is, it seems, in even in some of his letters that, you know, that he is I guess Catholic, right? Or he is, was he Catholic
yes.
or was he Protestant? Yeah, he's Catholic, right?
He was Roman Catholic.
Um
His wife was it was kind of Protestant, but like she had to
right.
convert in order for them to marry. Yeah. So,
Right. That was the part I remembered, is that one of
mm,
them was one and one was the other, and they had to figure
mm,
out that piece.
yeah.
Um but that nonetheless, like in his writing, in his work, he does use Christianity, I think, quite well, you know, in
Yeah.
terms of thinking about like, okay, I'm speaking to this audience. These are the point of views that they're going to be um, you know, looking for. And so I'm gonna go to the Bible, or I'm gonna go to scripture and find also perspectives that show that from a Christian point of view, that really the only kind of social system or economic political system that would make sense would be a socialist one. And so anyways, there's that piece. There's the way that he uses Christianity, I think, quite effectively from a kind of rhetorical perspective,
Yeah.
but there's also this notion that within Irish, with it subsequently after he's killed, he gets sort of turned into a Christian socialist. And so I found those things interesting to think about together a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, like going back, like to the history of the Irish kind of yeah, like trade union movement, which I would be like I'm also a kind of historian of that. But like its dominant, its main like ideological apparatus is not socialism. It's Rerum Novarum, which is the Pope's encyclical of the 1880s, as far as I know. Uh, the duties of capital and labor, and this was the church's kind of attempt to to try and kind of neutralize socialist kind of kind of groupings in the working class. So they had a kind of concession that says that that capital has rights, but labor has rights as well, and they both need just to come together and kind of sort them out, and like live in like harmony. And you get this in terms of the Christian socialist kind of movement of the 1880s, 1890s in England as well. If it was to say where kind of Connolly breaks with that, is that he is, pardon the pun, but he's well versed in the Bible. There's not like just as I was footnoting his writings, just the litany of like quotes from the Bible and from Shakespeare. So he would throw these in. What I see in them is it's in like what he's doing there is it's the same as any kind of writer or kind of agitator. He's using a shorthand to save time to get to the core of the issue. He's if he was doing it today, he'd be using memes. He'd be using memes just as a way just to kind of get that point across in a tweet. So that's what he'd be doing. How I'm able to make that argument and actually be a bit more forceful on it is that Christian kind of socialism is based on empathy and maybe even sympathy anyway. That we must kind of sympathize with the plight of the poor and the working class. It may even go as far as to say that we have empathy with the poor and the working class. But what he's involved in is giving agency to the working class. That's a different beast. That's class consciousness. And that's where he differs. So if he wasn't focusing on giving agency to the working class to be the kind of creators of their own future, then you probably could say yes. He's a Christian socialist, and it's that element of giving agency to the working class that made him such an awkward figure in Ireland for much of the 20th and 21st kind of century, because this isn't about a paternalistic socialism. This is actually agency based on the working class being the creators of their own kind of futures themselves, and using struggle it's through struggle that you raise class consciousness. So he's all about kind of struggle and doing that. And for me, that's the difference. It's not about empathy, it's about agency, and that scares them. To give agency, but to the oppressed, sure, no. Keep a charity and keep with work all day and live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. You know. So I mean, so it's that type of Christian socialism, which like again, like one of its main protagonists, it was another Irishman. It was George Bernard Shaw through the Fabians.
Hmm.
Who lived about 15 minutes away from where Connolly lived in Dublin. Again, going back to how small Dublin is. It's a small city.
100%. Yeah. I mean, you made me think of one of the stories that he writes to, or one of the pieces that he writes where he talks about, um, he talks about the famine,
Mm,
the Gortamor,
mm,
but he's also thinking about, because there's the big famous one, of course, but then there's subsequent issues, right? And he's talking
yeah,
about them also in the 1890s and so on. Um, and he actually chastises, or that maybe that's not the right word. He What he says is, he says that Irish people should steal food because it's being exported out of
yeah,
Ireland and they need it, and that um they're being moralized, as you said. What made me think of it is you talked about that lay in the hay, and you'll be pie in the sky, when you die or whatever. They're being sort of, there's an internal, or there's a Christian sort of message being taught to them, that if they suffer and do so kind of piously, and um you know don't beg for chair. It's a weird kind of argument, but it's basically an argument that that Irish people are kind of allowing themselves to be exterminated in certain ways through this when there is food that they could seize and feed themselves because
Yeah.
it's being exported out. And I thought that was a really interesting piece too, because he does also use some biblical references also to say, like, God wouldn't want you to do this either. Like,
No. Yeah.
yeah, anyway.
Yeah, yeah, and there was a famine distress in Kerry in the south of Ireland in like 1897, 1898, and Connolly kind of covers this. As a journalist, this was mainly kind of found by a great kind of Irish historian called Paul Dillon, and he had found this work about 24 years ago, and again it was that by Connolly, he really thought that the famine was kind of coming back, and he saw that there's a way to do these things to actually kind of raise kind of the class kind of like the consciousness, but to fight back then as well. Now, as it is, the the food distress didn't turn out the way that they thought. There was some relief kind of given, but it was quite real. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, somebody said in the chat it was a genocide. The famine was just the icing, and 100%. I mean, there's good work on,
Yeah.
understanding the actual famine.
On that, just going back to Ireland's role in terms of Britain, the population of the island falls by 2 million from 1845 until 1853 or so. So there's 1 million who are, it's thought, died of famine and or disease, and there's another 1 million who had emigrated. At the same time, uh, the the number of heads of livestock on the land increases by 2 million during that period as well. So you have a direct, brutal transfer of the use of land in Ireland over kind of 6 years. We're seeing this in Gaza now,
Mhm.
where famine has been used as a tool of imperialism. Absolutely.
100%.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Um, so let's talk a little bit about the ways that Connolly's anti-imperialism shows up in the book. A few things I noted is how central he understood the Irish struggle to be against a struggle against British Empire or British imperialism. Not just a struggle that was solely for Irish people for their own independence, but he really did articulate at certain points in this book, that he saw it as part of a broader anti-colonial struggle against British imperialism and saw it as a really key site of that struggle. Um, and at the same time, like, and this was kind of interesting, as you mentioned, like early on, he's in Edinburgh and he's like, he's organizing and he's working within, kind of socialist and trade union spaces as well there. And, so what I found interesting is that he also we talked about his analysis a little bit earlier about the kind of colonial bourgeoisie or strata within Ireland. He also understood that even though they might not be the best Marxists, that British people or people in Great Britain, uh, that they weren't necessarily he didn't see the average British worker as an enemy of the Irish
No.
worker. He saw them as potential allies and people in solidarity, but he did understand the colonial question in ways that they did not. And so, yeah, what are some of the elements for you that stood out in terms of, his kind of analysis around anti-imperialism in the book?
Well, we do have a couple of, at least kind of one or two writings which he did on India. So again, he was writing about, he was always kind of raising kind of that view of what the British Empire really is. It's not, he's battling against the who's the white man's boarding, who's the writer, Kipling. So he's battling against that kind of that kind of Kipling-esque view of what the British Empire is this kind of benign father figure that is helping all these countries that just can't run themselves. God bless them, and he's completely kind of battling against that. So in his arguments for India, he writes about the level of cultural and social sophistication that was in the the Indian kind of continent before Britain shows up, and how that's all kind of destroyed in the pursuit of capital. And he's doing that again because he's constantly trying to say that even for British kind of workers, they have to be anti-imperialist as well. In the next kind of volume from 1898 to 1903, it covers his. There was a couple of kind of anti-imperialist kind of protests in Dublin around the Boer War. So they were protesting against the Britain in kind of South Africa. That may seem somewhat kind of like problematic to us today because of it. It is very much it's almost kind of supporting the kind of colonial settler class and not the actual kind of indigenous kind of population. And it's a valid kind of comment. What I think they were doing though is, again, he's using that to raise the stark nature of the imperial state. So he's raising the concentration camps. They're raising just the mass executions, all the coercive strategies that imperialism is kind of using. So what I see in is that it's a constant, anything they can use or kind of he can use to raise the imperialist nature of kind of capitalism. He is trying to do.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that was one of the pieces I found interesting. Um, you brought up the Boer War, and I'm kind of curious. I was a little bit interested in. I wonder how like his time in America and other things sort of begin to, as he gets towards the end of his life, if we ever see him kind of show some solidarity with Black people or African people, because there were some comments I did notice, like he uses that phrase, like the dark Egypt, there's an anarchy, dark Egypt comment, and stuff like that. And I was like, there's probably some, kind of colonial anti-Blackness that has been sort of imposed here, but obviously he probably didn't have a whole lot of interaction in that time with people from Africa or whatever. But that was one spot where you mentioned that on the Boer War, and I was wondering kind of later on if he does come to any kind of different conclusions or even talk about it, because he doesn't really talk about Africa within the text at all. It's the one spot
No,
where,
no,
within the
no,
empire.
no. It's mainly India, or Egypt sometimes as well. So in some of the later writings, he talks about Egypt. He talks briefly. There's one kind of reference to the kind of Cuban War, where he's talking about American imperialism in terms of the Cuban War in the early 1900s. But yeah, he uses at least one racist term in the book, at least that I found. So these are issues that are it's one of those things that if you're going to print everything, then you print everything.
100%. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, no.
So if you do it right, it then do it right. But in terms of it dealing with the race issue in the US, I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting just kind of delve into this kind of US kind of writings finally, just to
Yeah.
basically do it
Yeah, because
and see
he
if he
spent
did.
he's yeah, because he spent some time with the IWW too, I believe, and they
He's an
were like
organizer.
kind of pioneering in terms of
Mm,
integrating unions in the
yeah.
US. So yeah, it would
When
be
he was
interesting.
there was he stood for election for the city council in January 1902, and he stood on an anti-racist, pro-migrant kind of platform. He issued at least one leaflet in Yiddish. It's a Hebrew script, but it's in Yiddish, because there was fierce kind of racism in Dublin at that time, there towards the mainly kind of Eastern European Jewish population who had arrived in the 1880s kind of onwards, and he's calling for their votes and saying that says that that like in it, he says that capitalism uses race to can divide us. This is one of its strategies. Don't be fooled by this. So it says we will, or I will work on your behalf because race is just there to can divide us. So I mean, like he certainly had the politics right, but whether that like translates over in terms of people of color, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, like he definitely, like you said, with India, like he's able to, see
Mm.
this,
Yeah.
and so I mean, it's, but yeah, that'll be interesting to see, getting into the U.S. writings. I'd be curious about stuff
Mm.
that maybe came, because yeah, the IWW, like we did a conversation a few years ago about Ben Fletcher, for instance, and he
Oh
was
yeah, yeah.
a black
Mm.
IWW organizer in Philadelphia, and yeah. So anyway, an interesting thing to be revealed on that. Um, there's this other piece too. You kind of referenced it early on about because you talked about this charge that's kind of thrown at Connolly that he wanted to revive a kind of sort of pre-colonial Irish, system, and um, I don't see that anywhere in what you've published, but I do
Mm.
see an interesting discussion of the kind of Irish chieftain system and a discussion of kind of the democracy that was within the system, as well as the kind of communal nature of land use under the system. And I had some familiarity with this history, but I just appreciated kind of his analysis here because I see it in that tradition of a lot of Marxists of
Mm.
saying, okay, well, what's the basis within our own society and in our own history that we're going to draw upon also to kind of demonstrate to people also that other ways of living are possible, right? And that we have
Mm.
some of our own traditions of this. Um, and so there's a quote here where he writes, when the Irish ancestral system was destroyed by violence in 1649, the social character of the Irish people's struggle disappeared too. It took on the appearance of a purely political struggle for independence, end quote. And this kind of gets also, I think it's in the same piece where he does the thing you talked about earlier, where he acknowledges that, if this had not been destroyed by violence, that eventually capitalism would have kind of evolved within Ireland.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, talk a little bit about this perspective on kind of how he uses this history of the chieftain system, as well as the process through which he also describes how it was subverted, and I found that interesting as well.
Yeah, I mean, like he's walking. It's a fine line that he's kind of walking there because you can see how once it goes down that road, how those arguments about you have this kind of weird idea of going back to the Brehon laws and going back to the chieftain kind of system, But what I think he's trying to do there is that he's trying to highlight that like capitalism was a foreign imposition in Ireland at that time. He makes the argument that it would have been an indigenous one, but it would have been different. So like what I see in what he's doing there is that he's just trying to hammer home time and time and like time again that the form of kind of capitalism is what we would now call it's a colonial form of it. It was imposed through violence from the outside. It may have been imposed through violence from the inside, but there would have been different social kind of class kind of relations then. So that's where I see like what he's trying then to do, and then also it's that It's that kind of street kind of agitator where they're using kind of shortcuts to try and say to people, this is in the like ether, like around kind of Irish kind of culture. There's a Celtic kind of revival that is going on from the 1890s onwards. Connolly saw himself as part of that, and actually writes in the intro to Labour in like Irish history. That's the final one in like 1910. Writes that this book should be seen as part of the Celtic kind of revival. You can see how that could be misread in that he was trying to go back to a W.B. Yeatsian kind of kind of a misty-eyed view of the Cliffs of Moher and fucking Connemara, and you don't get that impression from his writings, So that's what leads me then to like say or like argue that he's using these things to try and kind of highlight the difference that is kind of capitalism and the difference that is kind of colonial capitalism in Ireland itself. Whether that like I have to admit, I always found it the weakest part of his writings. I still do. I'm not sure it worked. I think he caused himself more trouble than it's worth. But that's what I see it as. And I don't think it's a delusion on my part either. I do think that because of the way that he uses it and how he kind of quickly moves on, that's what he's really kind of playing at, But like if anyone asked me like what is a weak part in his kind of in his whole kind of argument, I would see it as that because it's too layered. He used the wrong meme, He just used the wrong meme and started going, you should have used something else. This is too cliched now, But however.
I appreciate it. Say a little bit more though about the point that he's making about it took on the appearance of a purely political struggle for independence, because I think that's an interesting element to the argument that he's making, is the way that because of the kind of colonial capitalism that comes into play, I see him as arguing that this bolsters people who just sort of argue like we just need political independence.
Yeah. It bolsters it. How or like just make that point again. Sorry, like I didn't quite.
Yeah. So I see him arguing that because he says when the Irish ancestral system was destroyed by violence in 1649, the social character of the Irish people's struggle disappeared too, and it took the appearance of a purely political struggle for independence. So I see this also as part of his part of what he's arguing against a kind of a more traditional kind of conservative republicanism that's looking just for home rule.
Yeah. I mean, this goes back into, I mean, what you read out there, I mean, that's the article that he wrote for Light, for the Polish magazine, in April 98. But that quote he uses kind of almost kind of word for word in Labour in Irish history, and he keeps it as part of his whole kind of analysis until 1910. It's always part of his way of like thinking. And if I could maybe kind of explain that, and that like what he's talking about again is that kind of hidden history of kind of radicalism in Ireland post 1800, really. So post in 1798 there's rebellion against an Irish kind of parliament that's linked to Britain, and in 1800 that's kind of defeated. And what Britain does then is that it then brings the entire Ireland into Great Britain. So that becomes then, so up till 1800, you have Great Britain and Ireland, and so it's England, Scotland, and Ireland as part of three kingdoms. You have kind of Great Britain and Ireland as kind of two kingdoms, and in 1801 it becomes the United Kingdom. So that's the UK then is formed forcefully. It's against the like will of the people on the island. But what you get then is a nationalist movement that wants to go back to the pre 1800 kind of parliament, which had all of the kind of inequalities that were there as well. But there's another movement that says no, if we're going to have kind of independence now, then we need to have social rights as well, and get with the times. And the largest kind of leader who's against this, who's the ultra kind of conservative, quite kind of right wing, he'd be a neoliberal if he's around today, is like Daniel O'Connell, who's seen as the great father of Irish kind of freedom. Anytime his conservatism is like brought up, people say, "Oh well, he was anti-slavery." There was nobody in Britain in 1830 he was pro-slavery. It just wasn't where British politics was then. Anyway, it would have been very weird if he was as an MP he was pro-slavery in like 1836. But however, in the 1830s in Britain, there's a movement called Chartism, which is a movement for social and economic rights and voting rights for the working class. And in the late kind of 1830s, early 1840s, there are very prominent Irish kind of leaders in that movement in England, and they're able to get repeal of the Act of Union as part of the core demands of the Chartist movement. And Daniel O'Connell rejects it, and he rejects their help, and he attacks kind of Chartism as a plague, as anti-Catholic, as anti-church, as just as an evil that's against anything that is natural about how things should be done. Now, why is the leader of kind of the repeal of the Act of Union, like the leader of the repeal movement, why is he rejecting the support of hundreds of thousands of people in England? He rejects it because to take on their support would also bring on social rights, and he was against that. So Connolly highlights this in Labour in like Irish history, but that's what he means by the nationalist movement became purely a kind of political independence kind of movement, and it did so through force and through kind of coercion. Those other kind of radical elements, they were kind of pushed out of like Irish history. So people like Patrick O'Higgins, he was a Chartist based in Dublin. He's written out of kind of Irish history. Thaddeus O'Malley, who writes a charter for kind of workers' rights in 1848 as part of of any future kind of Irish kind of parliament. He's also kind of written out of kind of Irish history. So what Connolly is doing is that he's part of that smaller but quite radical, kind of independence kind of movement that also sees social rights as key to like independence, because they also can understand that these are imperial links, that we have these deep inequalities, not just because of the workings of the market, but because of the imperialist nature of the workings of those markets as they pertain to Ireland. So you have to be anti-imperialist if you're genuinely kind of a nationalist in like Ireland. This is what leads, Connolly to almost saying that it's a scientific necessity that you're anti-kind of imperialist if you're an Irish kind of nationalist, because you have to. Like if you keep those economic workings, you keep kind of imperialism. So what's the point then? You have to break with it. And these arguments are being made in their own kind of languages, in their own kind of wordings and forms in the 1840s and 1850s and like 1860s as well. It's all written out of Irish history. It isn't part of the narrative. Even on the left, it isn't.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Mm.
Um, let's see. So I have a couple audience questions too, but I will.
Oh, this is I completely forgot that we're actually on YouTube and this is live. I was just having a chat.
No, 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 no. This has been great,
uh, uh,
and people are appreciative of it. So, uh, there's So there's one more piece question I did want to ask about, or one piece I wanted to ask about. Is a piece that he wrote, which was called "Can Irish Republicans Be Politicians?"
Mm.
And I thought this was a very interesting intervention. I mean, partly because now, I mean, part of my question would be, are they anything else? um, but in the time, you know, he's actually talking about something very different than kind of the problem we might have today. So say a little bit about kind of the intervention he was making there in 1896. It's one of the last pieces that he wrote in this
Yeah,
period of agitation.
yeah, it's a piece that he wrote for an Irish nationalist kind of newspaper called Shan Van Vocht, which is the old woman, and it's the old poor woman, which is supposed to be Ireland, and and it's a very particular article that speaks to very particular dynamics in the Irish nationalist and kind of Republican movement. One that even though it is kind of particular, I think will still make sense to people today because it is kind of there. Um, that kind of tradition of more radical republicanism was a secret society type of form. So that was the organizational kind of format that it would kind of take on, starting in the modern era, really with the Fenian movement that starts actually in the US and then it moves then back over then to Ireland as the IRB. So he's saying that 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 like if you want to gain kind of independence, you need to embrace kind of politics. But he's doing it not in terms of saying that you need to be constitutional. He's more or less saying that in words, if I just get the actual kind of article here, he's more or less saying that if you want to bring people with them, then you need to raise kind of consciousness on these kind of matters. And you're not going to be able to do that if you're working as a conspiratorial secret society. He makes the point that unlike in other countries in Europe at that time, you can operate in the open and in the public in Ireland and in Britain. Now there were secret police and spies everywhere, but you could still operate, with some level of kind of you know freedom, like shall we say, it's not what Lenin is facing in the 1900s. It isn't that at all. So he's saying that given that we can operate out in the open and call for these things, why don't we? Like you're not going to win people over by by um kind of codding them. Do you have that phrase in the US? To cod someone. I go by
Um,
your phrase. It's no. Okay. Sorry. It's an Irishism. It's to fool someone. Like if you're pulling the wool over their eyes, um, that you're not going to win like independence by pulling the wool like over kind of people's eyes. That you need to just say what you're going to do and then do it. And like his argument is that if you do that, then the public can actually then pull you up if you don't follow through on what you're saying. But what he's doing, I think, though, again, is going back to the struggle is the way that you raise class consciousness. You don't raise class consciousness with a blackboard and chalk. You have to engage in the struggle itself. So if you're not engaged in politics, then you're missing out on a realm of the class struggle where people can raise can then raise kind of class kind of consciousness. Like I mean, um, yeah, and also that it also, like, his argument is that if you are conspiratorial, if you don't engage in this, then those who are pulling the wool over your eyes, they get free reign because then there's no kind of alternative. So his whole point about setting up the ISRP was very public about that we are a socialist Republican party. These are our objectives. This is what we want to do. and then we're going to have meetings and argue if like for these things and try and bring people down with us. You can't do that if you're the conspiracy. You're hoping
Yeah.
then to just kind of seize power afterwards. And he's saying that has never worked for us. He's talking in like 19 in 1998, and he's talking about the various bomb campaigns of the Fenians in like 1867. There was a quite disastrous bombing campaign of like London, and of kind of Manchester. Marx kind of writes about this. So Marx writes about having to, in public, defend the like Fenians, but in private going, for fuck's sake, and because it just makes things kind of awkward. And I like that's what I would see it as. He's not arguing for a kind of parliamentary road. He's saying that politics is a platform for raising class consciousness. So why don't we use it? So like he is speaking to a very particular culture in Irish republicanism, one that of course is like still there. That hopes to seize power rather than build power.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciated it. I mean, there's like it's a really interesting, like, I also thought about it a little bit through like history of kind of Marxist guerrilla movements and things like this too, and like kind of
Mm.
understanding even before, this is before a lot of that stuff gets written, but kind of understanding that there needs to be a mass base to also support what
Yeah,
you're doing, and that like if you're just like you say, if you're just blowing stuff up or if you're just like going on this raid or whatever, and people don't know why you're doing it, then why would they support you or defend you or provide you
yeah,
shelter or any of those kind of things?
yeah.
And
It's the Chinese Communist Party in the 1930s. I mean, it's their whole kind of philosophy that you bring the village with you.
yeah, yeah.
And then you're lost kind of without
Uh,
it.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, so many good pieces, so many other things that we could touch on. I mean, it's like
Sorry, on that point about
yeah,
about about how kind of anti-conspiratorial Connolly was in January 1916. He's more or less on board that there will be a violent uprising against British rule sometime in 1916, and he writes about it in his newspaper. So he puts it in his newspaper in some kind of coded language that now's the time to like strike, and like we're going to get busy. And sure, the IRB went absolutely nuts and they had to pull him up, saying, "You can't write this in your Jesus newspaper. You can't be telling people in your newspaper that you're going to take part in a violent conspiracy against imperial rule and give them the kind of heads up on this." So yeah, even in like 1916, he still had a view of tell all the people. So yeah, maybe not the
yeah,
best idea, but however.
yeah, maybe not always, but yeah, but I appreciate kind of the consistency on the kind of perspective of it all.
Yeah.
All right, so a couple things from folks. So Matt Clubbin asked, besides this book, any good places to direct Irish people I know to learn the revolutionary Irish history that's been buried, right? So like you've talked about kind of this suppression of these politics, and are there other books that you think of that are really good about kind of excavating some of that work?
Yeah, like there's a really good book. It's coming on 30 years old now, but it's a good kind of starting point, and it's by an Irish historian called Fintan Lane, Fintanlane, and he wrote a book called The Origins of Modern Irish Socialism, and he delves with this. There's another, where is it? There's another one there. I can't see it at the moment. I might just send on just a few kind of names to you. There's a good one. There's a good collection of kind of essays that deals with this. Now, when I talk about that, there's some really strong work on the radical agrarian history in Ireland. Where it kind of falls down, and I should actually make that point, I'm sorry, it's more for the more kind of urban, kind of working class kind of, kind of radical kind of history. In terms of the agrarian kind of history, in terms of the white boys and the People Day boys and the Billy Welters, these were kind of secret kind of societies that were proto trade unions, really, that were around to more or less kind of dampen the prices of rents and so forth. One of the most kind of infamous in terms of like US history would be, there was a version of them known as the Molly kind of McGuires, and they ended up, that idea being kind of gets kind of kind of transferred over like to the US. Although whether the US kind of Molly McGuires was a scarecrow or a real kind of group, I don't know. But that idea was still kind of brought up. It was still kind of brought over. So in terms of the agrarian history, it has some really good work out there, Donnelly and like so forth. It's in terms of the working class kind of history, it gets a bit kind of weak. I'd say kind of Fintan Lane's work is probably the best kind of starting point. Outside of that, historians tend to focus in on where the documents are, and that's in trade union history. So you get histories of the trade union movement in Ireland in the 19th century, but that's not really. It's a very poor kind of substitute for working class history. So no, I mean, like I'd say that's something that needs to be done. We don't have our E.P. Thompson, to write the origins of the English working class. That book probably needs to be written. But I'd say kind of Fintan Lane, Brian Casey does some really good work as well. And he's the editor of that volume that I can't think of now. So there is some good work being done in the last kind of 10, 15 years. So sorry,
Well,
I, I should have been kind of clear there that it's in terms of the more kind of urban-based kind of working class kind of history rather than kind of agrarian history. There's some great work done on the land wars of the 1880s. So the Land League and the land wars and kind of look at David, and really kind of fascinating stuff. And in terms of how that idea of kind of communal land ownership that was being kind of put forward by elements in the Land League turns into private property ownership rights by the conservative elements in the 1880s against the kind of will of like Michael Davitt. So yeah.
Yeah, that's good. We should you can send me some stuff afterwards too,
Yeah.
and I can add it to the chat afterwards or
Yeah.
to the comments so people can so folks, if you're looking for book recommendations, check back the comments in about 24 hours and I'll have a few things added to it. But thank you. Let's see. So somebody asked you if you could expand a little bit on some of you mentioned Mahdi Amel from Lebanon, and just if there was more that you wanted to say kind of about that, maybe that connection to Connolly in terms of what they were thinking about, or just maybe more about his work.
Well, I mean, reading him is just brilliance. I mean, I only kind of came across him fairly recently in that there's a collection of like translations that were brought out, I think by Haymarket, I think in the last couple of years, and it's absolutely brilliant. And I'm reading it, and I'm there going, "This is Ireland. This is Ireland. This is Ireland." It's incredible, and even kind of his kind of analysis in terms of that kind of middleman intermediary kind of the comprador class. And what I like about kind of Admal is that he has a contempt for the phrase underdeveloped and under kind of development, and rightly so. It was invented by the World Bank in the 1950s, and and that idea, like what I love in his writings, something that Connolly doesn't do, but that Mel kind of makes very, very clear, is that there is no stages here. Under the 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 kind of colonial states are not underdeveloped capitalist states. They are capitalist states. That's the nature of this beast. It is a vicious extractive system. You're cutting yourself if you think that this is just one stage towards a, a kind of capitalist state where these type of states aren't needed. It demands kind of colonialism. It demands it. It's why it has kind of all its armies. It needs these extractive spheres in order to operate. The 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 kind of disconnect there between what's happening in so-called underdevelopment states and kind of capitalism, that's a false argument. And I think that's where kind of Ireland kind of fits in. That like why I'm fascinated by kind of Irish kind of capitalism, it's what I'm writing a books about, is for that reason. I think it can tell us something about how capitalism operates. For that reason, it's a cod to like say that there are underdeveloped states. Even using kind of that phrasing, you're falling into the myths of free trade and of equal, that somehow kind of capitalism is not one vast social machine for 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 transforming human energy and nature into the money form. That is its sole organizational principle. It took hundreds of years for it to kind of nail it down, but it's been built upon genocide, war, slavery, and racism. These are the tools that enabled it to create this bizarre social system that is about transforming human energy and nature into the money form, where it is then highly kind of portable, and you put kind of property rights on the ownership of that kind of money form. It's a medieval idea that is still with us today, and it needs to be consigned to the history books. But that's what I love about kind of that's my rant from Amal, and like reading his work is that he makes it absolutely clear. You are cutting yourself if you think that there are stages here. This is how it can operate, and we'll always need this because it is extractive. It does not create. It creates systems in order to extract wealth. It does not create wealth. It creates systems for the extraction of wealth. So then it needs spaces to extract that wealth from, and be they in terms of labor or the working day, or in terms of actual kind of colonial states then themselves. No, Amels is absolutely brilliant, and they knew what they were doing when they assassinated them.
Yeah,
Yeah,
unfortunately. And so let's go just before you go. That one of the things that I didn't really didn't really ask you directly that I found interesting is like, again, in your introduction, and we've talked about it, like there's all the ways that Connolly's writings, like you said, you thought maybe you'd find one piece or a couple pieces, then you find 18, and then you also find, as you mentioned earlier, that a lot of what gets reproduced of his writings is edited in certain ways to take
yeah.
certain things out to kind of, and so what are some of the things that, uh, maybe specifically in some of his writings that were taken out or just that are not there that you think are really important in terms of really getting a better picture of his politics? Like what's the yeah, say a little bit about that.
But for me, like the most kind of stark, kind of example of that, it's with his essay, nationalism and socialism, which he then kind of rewrote as socialism and and kind of nationalism. And this is one of his most quoted pieces. It's one of his most kind of famous kind of articles. Um, and it was reproduced in 1948 by William O'Brien, who was head of the ITG. He was former head of the Irish Transport Workers Union. Very right wing, very Catholic, very conservative, and he's writing in 1940s Ireland, and he's editing the works of kind of James Connolly. And I'll read what he kind of wrote, or like what the piece kind of reads like now. Of well, kind of prior to this, it's no. But Connolly writes that it may be pleaded that the ideal of a socialist republic, implying as it does a complete political and economic like revolution, would be sure to alienate all our middle class and aristocratic sympathizers who would dread the loss of their privileges and property. Quite bland. It's a quite okay. What O'Brien took out was Connolly's definition as to what that socialist public would look like. So what he took out was what it actually reads as is, it may be pleaded that the ideal of a socialist republic, implying as it does a political and economic revolution, vesting the entire ownership of land, railways, machinery, and instruments of labor generally in the hands of those who use them in town and country, to be controlled by their own associations, freely elected on a basis of perfect equality and universal suffrage, subordinate to and represented in the Democratic Congress of an independent Irish state. Gone, taken out in 1948, where he gives flesh, he puts flesh on the bones as to what he means by a social republic. O'Brien kept it vague, but he says it very, very clearly. This is about the nationalization of land, machinery, and instruments of labor, and not just nationalization in terms of a centralized state, but nationalization and then controlled at as local a level as is possible by communities that are freely elected. It's socialist, so that gives you a flavor as to what was happening in terms of his writings. That's one example.
No, that's great. That's great. It's a very illustrative example of what you're talking about, you know. Uh okay. So Kelly asked, does he, and in this case they meant James Connolly. Did he ever critique Michael Davitt and the Landleaguers? Yeah.
He did. He'd a love hate, kind of Davitt, mainly because not so much of the Landleaguers, but because Davitt by the 1900s is quite involved in labor politics in Britain, and he's seen as a bit of a sellout, or he's not being kind of as radical as is possible. So he will sometimes write pieces that are very kind of critical of kind of Michael Davitt, and then he will share a platform with him about against British kind of imperialism, and then he'll praise him maybe kind of somewhere else. This is all kind of later on in the later kind of writings. So he had a complicated view in terms of Davitt. He was extremely kind of critical of Davitt for what he saw as Davitt's bourgeois social democratic compromises in terms of organizing kind of working class people in England. And then he'll share a kind of platform then with him. What does come across is that view that Connolly was quite anti-sectarian in his politics. He would work with almost anyone, It changes a bit in the US, but certainly in Dublin, if you're in any way a progressive, he would try and work off them. But no, he was kind of, and in his own way, being Connolly, he can be quite cutting. So he would twist the knife kind of sometimes on Davitt. So yeah, he was critical of him, but more in terms of the labor movement and Davitt's second kind of career, really, as a labor, kind of working class labor advocate, rather than in terms of the Land League itself. He's more critical of Parnell and that element of it, which Davitt was as well.
One question I had too is because he does use the language of social democrat, social democracy a bit in the book. Do you read that as because my understanding is that term kind of meant something a little bit different earlier on than we would think of it now, and so I was curious if you thought there's an evolution from a kind of social democratic Connolly to a more of a, because it feels like the scientific socialism is always kind of there within his work. Not always, I'm sure, but from the earliest writings, kind of. And so, yeah, I was curious if just your thoughts on the use of that term within the book.
Well, actually, there's an interesting kind of piece on that he wrote in July 1894, where he deals with that, and he talks about social democracy versus stake and socialism. And he talks about how, he's writing into the Edinburgh Evening News, and he's writing in saying, please, people, would you stop confusing Bismarck type social democracy with what we're doing, with what we're kind of arguing for? Because, he was part of the social democratic federation, and he said these are just the same words, they're not the same kind of meaning. And he goes into that kind of kind of very thing itself. So he was kind of aware that he was using that, even the name of his kind of organization was being confused, or was being kind of supplanted by what was going on in terms of Germany and the so-called kind of socialists in the Bundestag. So yeah, he is trying to deal with that phrase. What he does kind of settle on with, kind of later on in the late 1900s, is a cooperative commonwealth. So that's the phrase that they kind of settle upon in terms of what their vision is that we're trying to build a cooperative, a commonwealth, as a workable kind of society. And then no, it's a really good point about how how he was aware of these things. So again, as an agitator, he's trying to find kind of language where he's able to meet people halfway and still get across kind of his meaning. It's an art form itself.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I found that really interesting within the book.
Mm.
Um, last question we'll take. So, Aaron, thank you. So, uh, you talk about some of the different people who have worked on Connolly's legacy within the introduction. I
Mm.
assume this is what Aaron's referring to.
Yeah.
Are there any of them that you feel are, kind of some of the better ones of them, or are they all, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. It would be a different book then, because what I was kind of focusing in on was the mechanics of the production of his writings. So it's a purely mechanical exercise. Someone writes these words. Do you reproduce them, or do you not can reproduce them? If you can reproduce them, how well do you do that? So this is just what's been asked there really is more of an interpretive book in terms of kind of James Connolly, in terms of the secondary kind of sources. That's not what I'm doing here. I just focus in on those who have edited his works in the past, and what was the standard, or what was the approach in which they did. So it's purely kind of technical. I mean, this is just one editor looking at other kind of editors and seeing what they did and what they did wrong. I mean, no one's perfect. I'm not trying to put forward a kind of impossible kind of standards. I mean, everyone has typos. So let's not go down that road of kind of tripping people up for kind of typos. But there's a difference between typos and where work is being edited to change its entire meaning. That is dishonest. You don't do that. That's just being kind of dishonest. I mean, I have a certain view on kind of James Connolly, but I'm confident enough in it that here's all his works. Everything I found is in that book. Everything. We didn't change one word. Everything I found that he wrote, every speech that was kind of reported, any meeting that he was at, even down to him. My favorite one is when he was organizing the Inter Dublin Working Men's Club's billiards competition. So he's organizing this kind of a billiards league table. If it's collected works of James Connolly, and if I'm the editor, that's going in. So everything went in. Then it's up to others to say that does my vision of what I think he's at, which is an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial kind of Marxism, does that stand or fall? I think it does stand. I'm not going to change his words and be kind of cynical about it to do it. So no, I mean, in terms of the people who I talk about, it should be Donald Nevin, William O'Brien, Desmond Ryan, and so forth. It's mainly on the mechanics. As a practitioner, how do they kind of fall up, you know. So that is really it. And I have my kind of criticisms then. An interpretation of James Connolly, sure, we'd be here all day then with that. Like, you know, there are as many kind of, you know, interpretations of him as there are kind of blades of grass on the cliffs of Moher, you know.
Indeed. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And again, I just want to thank you for putting this together and just remind people to purchase a copy, to get a copy for yourself, but also like if you just want to check it out and you just want to like you can just download that free PDF too on
Yeah,
iskrabooks.com or .org, sorry, and you know, and also just check out their other work there too. They have so much good stuff that they've excavated that is, you know, usually things that are not as easy to find, you know, and so I definitely encourage people to check out what they're doing and to check it out for yourselves, you know, and then support it if you can, for sure. Connor, this has been great. Is there anything else that you want to add in closing? Sorry, I really have appreciated this interview.
no. It's just basically that, like, again, going back to kind of Ishra's kind of model. It's a fantastic model for kind of radical texts. I'm not going down the road of saying that radicals should produce work for free. Like Connolly is great on that. Like he says that, like anything he did, he says you get paid for it. This is work, so you get paid for it. So I really have a problem with people expecting radical authors and radical kind of editors to do stuff for free. It's not sustainable in the medium to long term. However, I love their kind of model in that the books are brilliant, so people will buy them anyway. But the texts are there and they're free. If it's a radical text, it's there. Just share and use it as you wish. It's a fantastic model. It should be the kind of template in terms of kind of radical texts anyway.
Yeah, I appreciate it so much. And
Mm,
yeah, agree. I really encourage people to check out the work that they're doing.
mm.
And
And
this is a
pay their bloody radicals. Pay them for feck's sake, you know.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, all right. Well, Connor, this has been great. I look forward to hopefully we can connect again in the future and
Yeah.
have another discussion. But in the meantime, you know, definitely encourage people to check out the work. And yeah, anything are any
No,
ways people could connect with you or anything else you want to add?
no. Just just my vague presence on kind of social media. But as with most kind of writers or like editors, I've got desperate social skills and are a natural curmudgeon. So it's probably best just keep to the books. All the best stuff is there, and
All
just
right.
leave it at that. Like, you know. So yeah,
All right, Connor. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful and
yeah.
have a great one. All right.
Cheers. Thank you.